Such an arbitrary combination of factors that are external for one another yields no law. Physiognomy, however, is supposed to differ from other questionable arts and pernicious studies because it considers specific individuality in the necessary antithesis of an inner and an outer, of character as a conscious disposition, and this again as an existent shape, and the way it relates these factors to each other is the way they are related by their notion. Hence, these factors must constitute the content of a law. In astrology, palmistry, and similar sciences, on the other hand, what seems to be related is only an outer to an outer, something or other to an element alien to it. This particular constellation at birth, and when this external element is brought closer to the body, these particular lines on the hand are external factors, indicating a longer or shorter life and the fate in general of the particular individual. Being externalities, they are indifferent towards each other and lack the necessity for one another that ought to lie in the relation of an outer to an inner. Paragraph 314 sees us picking up where the previous paragraph, 313, left off in talking about something that is completely arbitrary and contingent. So remember back what Hegel had talked about is the body being essentially reduced to a thing, which meant that it became a sign, which meant that it was incorporated into some sort of contingent or, as he said, capricious system of signs. And so he talks about this by saying, such an arbitrary combination of factors that are external for one another yields no law, and we're very interested, once again, in seeing whether we can find a law. So the rest of this paragraph, what Hegel is doing is comparing and contrasting physiognomy, physiognomic, which was now acknowledged as pseudoscience. Hegel recognized it as a pseudoscience in his own time, but it was quite popular at the time, against other things that were now being more readily recognized as essentially pseudosciences, that is, things pretending to the level or the sophistication or the predictability of science, but not really providing that. And the two examples that he gives here are astrology and palmistry. Astrology, I think we're all familiar with. Palmistry is when people read your palm. They look at your hand and they say, oh, well, your lifeline, very long, you're going to live a long time. But look, your love line, there's going to be breaks here and there. So Hegel is not actually endorsing this, but he's saying this is the way that people think about physiognomy. So what does physiognomy do? It at least purports to relate an inner of the human being to the outer. And what is the outer? As he calls it, existent shape, the Sein der Gestalt. And what is the inner? The conscious disposition, the bewusste Wesen, the being, the essence that is conscious, that is consciousness. And in both cases we have character, right? Character is an inner. Character is also displayed in an outer. And we've just come through some paragraphs where we talked about, speech and action, and how those display who we are, but they also, to a certain degree, escape us. And this is what physiognomic is supposed to be dealing with. It's supposed to connect these two together. Now he says, by contrast, if we look at, say, astrology, palmistry, and similar sciences, what seems to be related, what the person who is asserting that as a type of knowledge, or the person who is being taken in by it, the person who reads their horoscope in the paper and says, oh my goodness, this describes me to a T. I'd better follow this. The person is being taken in part because there is no relation of an inner to an outer. Rather, the relationship is merely that of an outer to another outer, an externality to another externality. So he goes on and he says, what we have here is something or other to an element alien to it. There's no real relation between these things. There's no real relation between your hand, and he's going to consider this in the following paragraphs, between your hand as the palmist understands it and your life or your fate or your destiny or anything along those lines, let alone your character. So he says, this particular constellation at birth and when this external element is brought closer to the body, these particular lines on the hand are external factors indicating a longer and shorter life and the fate in general of the particular individual, right? But there is no real connection between them, Hegel says, and it's interesting here to note that one thing that occurs when we're talking about pseudosciences is that merely being able to criticize something else as a pseudoscience doesn't establish what you're doing as actually scientific. This is actually something really well worth keeping in mind for the people who label themselves as critical thinkers, as skeptics in the good sense, because sometimes what they're doing is actually just as ad hoc and just as thrown together, just as unscientific as what the people here are doing. So the physiognomists are saying that, look, these things over here, yes, they're unscientific, but what we're doing is scientific. What's the basis? What's the pretension? They're not just relating one external thing that's arbitrarily connected with another thing. Instead, they're relating an inner to an outer. Like he says, the way in which it relates these factors to each other is the way they are related by their notion, by their begriff, by their concept. So there's supposed to be a kind of dynamic relationship between the character inside of a person, which is going to be displayed through their actions and their words, right? And the character as displayed by the physiography, by the face, for example, by the, as we're going to see a little bit later, the skull, the head, by the way in which the body displays itself, standing up straight as opposed to slouching over, smiling a lot as opposed to droopy mouth or something like that, right? I mean, we may as well, just to bring up a few silly examples, imagine if we were to apply this rigorously in our own time and think about all those crazy selfies with duck faces and what a physiognomist might draw from that as regards the character of the person. Very fertile ground for looking at all these things. Or think about how much variance we have just in a set of photographs of the same person in different circumstances. But here's the upshot. Because for the physiognomist, there is a relation between the inner and outer by the notion, that means that what we have here is a law. That means that we can say that we've finally found the intelligibility that we were looking for. So as opposed to the other pseudosciences, this one is not a pseudoscience, and it is going to yield us the intelligibility that allows us to connect these things together. Admittedly, the hand does not seem to be such a very external factor for fate. It seems rather to be related to it as something inner. For fate itself is also only the manifestation of what the particular individuality is in itself as an inner original specific character. Now, to find out what this particular individuality is in itself, the palmist, like the physiognomist, takes a shorter cut than, for example, Solon, who thought that he could only know this from and after the course of the whole life. He examined the manifestation, but the former examines the unexplicated in itself. That the hand, however, must represent the in itself of the individuality in respect of its fate is easy to see from the fact that, next to the organ of speech, it is the hand most of all by which a man manifests and actualizes himself. It is the living artificer of his fortune. We may say of the hand that it is what a man does, for in it, as the active organ of his self-fulfillment, he is present as the animating soul. And since he is primarily his own fate, His hand will thus express this in itself. In paragraph 315, it may appear to us at first that Hegel is going back on what he just said in the previous paragraph with respect to palmistry, talking about the hand and its significance. Because in the previous paragraph he said that, well, palmistry looks at the hand but just as something purely external, but really the hand is something inner when it comes to an individual's fate, their destiny, what it is that they are to be, which includes not only, whether they're rich or poor, but what kind of relationships they have, what sort of actions will be determinative of them. Will they be a thief? Will they be a king? Will they be a great lover? Will they be unhappy or destitute? All these sorts of things are a person's fate. And if we think about this is a bit of an aside. It's not as if we have our own fate totally in isolation from everybody else's fate that we could possibly think of in the world. But that's something that we can hold on to and come back to later. So let's look at what he says here. So he begins by saying the hand does not seem to be such a very external factor for fate. And why is that? Well, the hand is what actually does things. So insofar as our fate is a product of our action, of what it is that we do, then the hand is really, you might say, an inner factor insofar as we're using this metaphorical language of inner and outer, that which is understood as being driving or determinative as opposed to that which is determined. So he says, fate itself is also only the manifestation of what the particular individuality is in itself as an original specific character. He's got here Miller in the translation. But I put determinacy here because that works for Bestimmtheit, being determined, being bestimmt, being this way rather than that way. Original is ursprünglich, primordial is another way to translate that. So what it is that is in a person is supposed to be their fate. That's why you're not supposed to be able to escape your fate, right? Because you're born with it and it's just the way it happens to be. It'll express itself. So he says that to find out what this particular individuality is in itself, in what it is, in its being as such, the palmist, like the physiognomist, so they're both really on the same level here, takes a shorter cut than, for example, Solon. Now, who is Solon? Solon is an ancient Greek, let's call him a statesman, but also a poet who left behind some very interesting writings, much of which have to do with the nature of justice. And Solon, as we learn from Herodotus, said that we should count no person happy until they're dead. That seems like an awfully long time to wait, but there's a whole story behind it that we won't have to rehearse here. You can look it up. It's in the first book of Herodotus, very early on. And what's the general idea behind this that Solon is getting at? Well, a person's fate can go up or down. This is what we mean by, the wheel of fortune, right? It's not just a TV show. It's also a concept that has run throughout a literature in the Western world. The idea is that the wheel goes down. That's being, you don't want to be on the downside. And the wheel swings back up. And so you're, as we say, proverbially high on the hog for a while. But if it's not going to stay that way. And so we can talk about the goods of fortune. And this leads into a lot of interesting side paths that we don't want to follow out at this point. The point is here that Solon thinks that you need to look at a person, if not till the end of their life, at least consistently over time. And what are you looking at? So Solon says you could only know their fate from and after the course of the whole life. He examined the manifestation. He examined what actually happens. The relationship between the actions of the person and their ultimate culmination, or you might say the nexus of the entire pattern of a person's actions. So he says the former, the palmist, examines the in itself, not the for itself. The for itself isn't mentioned here, but the for itself is haunting this passage. Because what determines the hand, insofar as the hand is something inner and it's leading to actions? Well, we saw this in the previous paragraphs, didn't we? The hand is an expression or a manifestation of the individuality as consciousness, as choice, as self-determination, as something which is taking a stance upon itself within the scope of the world and the options that are available to it. So he goes on and he says that the hand must represent the in itself of the individuality in respect of fate is easy to see from this particular fact. And here Hegel is getting at something quite profound that I don't actually have on the chalkboard because it doesn't fit into this schema, but it's something that we should think about and explore. Next to the organ of speech, the mouth, it is the hand most of all by which a man manifests and actualizes himself. So let's think about that for a moment. What are the things that we look to in order to see who a person is? In order to make determinations about who they are and what kind of person they are and all the other things that go along with that. You might say, well, we look at the face. And we're going to talk about the face a little bit later on. Face is important, right? Now, unless we're actually, kind of eccentric, we don't worry about things like their kneecaps or their elbows or things like that. We don't take those as very expressive. The hand, we do. But not in the way that the palmist does. We don't get somebody and look at their hand and say, what do you think of that? Well, it's not even a matter of seeing, well, do you have dirt under your fingernails or do you have calluses or things like that? Those are interesting, but those are not as significative. The hand does things. The hand is the doer and also that by which it is done. As we're going to talk about a little bit later on, Aristotle calls the hand the tool of tools. It is the tool that drives the other tools. And what do we use tools for? To get things done, to accomplish what it is that we set for ourselves as means and as ends. So the hand manifests what it is that a person really wants, what it is that a person values, what it is that a person does. As a matter of fact, in a certain way, you could say that the hand might actually be more honest in its expression than the mouth is, right? Because we can contrast deeds and words, to use the ancient Greek way of talking about it, right? And a lot of people would say, well, I'm going to look at the deeds, not at the words. Here, Hegel says that the hand is not quite as expressive as the organ of speech, but it's pretty close. Why? It's the hand, most of all, by which a man manifests and actualizes himself. Speech doesn't do that quite as much. So here's a beautiful phrase here. It's the living artificer of his fortune. So what it is that our fate or our fortune or our destiny is really a matter of, if we want to be a little facetious, what we do with our hands. Look, I'm talking with my hands right now. I'm actually talking with my mouth, but waving my hands around. It's what we do. If Hegel was to consider, for example, these videos, I'm talking right now, but these videos are much more a product of the hand than they are of the mouth. Why? I turned on the camera. I set up this room. I wrote things on the chalkboard. We're going to get to writing in a few paragraphs from now. I'm doing all these sorts of things. My legs, of course, are involved because they're moving me from place to place, right? My face, you're seeing that. My mouth is talking these words. Presumably my brain is involved as well. But all of these fall within the realm, metaphorically, of the hand, of action. So that's very important to keep in mind. The hand is, as he says, the living artificer, the maker of a person's fortune. So he says, we may say of the hand that it is what a man does. So it's not that we look at the hand and see the lines on it and say, oh, well, those signify life or love or wealth or anything like that. Rather, we look at the hand and we say, wow, this hand has, got work in it, and work that has come out of it. And that is what the hand really is. So from Hegel's perspective, again, to continue this, these videos in my channel are the work of my hand. They are what my hand is. They will continue to be so long after I'm dead if these videos continue to be watched. Something very interesting to think about. He goes on and he says, as the active organ of his self-fulfillment, he is present as the animating soul. We're present in our hands. Again, this is why Aristotle can call the hand the tool of tools. If this is a tool, this is the tool that makes this tool work. If this is a tool, again, this is the tool that makes it work. Same thing with the recorder that I have. Same thing with the camera. Same thing with the lights that I've turned on. All of those are the fruit of my hand, or some sort of other intermediary that works like a hand. So he says, since the person is primarily their own fate, the hand will thus express this in itself. So if we want to look for a person's fate, again, we don't do it by looking at the fortuitous characteristics of the hand, even though it might be cool to get out a book and have somebody trace these sorts of things. That tells us nothing. What tells us something about a person is what they actually do, what their actions signify. From this nature of the organ of activity, to be a passive being as well as the action within it, or from the fact that the in-itselfness is itself present in it and has a being for others, we obtain another view of it than the preceding. Namely, if the organs in general show themselves to be incapable of being taken as expressions of the inner, because in them the action qua action is present, but the action qua completed deed is merely external, and inner and outer in this way fall apart, and are or can be alien to each other, then the organ must now, in accordance with its nature, be taken again as also a middle term of both. This very fact that the action is present in it constitutes an externality of it, and moreover one that is other than the deed, for the organ remains with and in the individual. Now, this middle term and unity of inner and outer is in the first place itself external too. But then this externality is at the same time taken up into the inner. As simple externality, it stands over against the dispersed externality, which either is merely a single deed, or condition contingent for the individuality as a whole, or else, as a total externality, is fate split up into a multiplicity of deeds and conditions. Thus, the simple lines of the hand, the timbre and compass of the voice, as the individual characteristic of speech, this too again as expressed in writing, where the hand gives it a more durable existence than the voice does, especially in the particular style of handwriting, all this is an expression of the inner, so that as a simple externality, the expression again stands over against the manifold externality of action and fate, stands in relation to them as an inner. Thus, if at first the specific nature and innate peculiarity of the individual, together with what these have become as a result of cultivation and education, are taken as the inner, as the essence of his action and his fate, then this essence has its appearance and externality to begin with in his mouth, hand, voice, handwriting, and the other organs and their permanent characteristics. Thereafter, and not till then, does it give itself further outward expression in its actual existence in the world. Paragraph 316 is a longish and very important and interesting paragraph because Hegel, as we've seen him do so many times before in the past, likes to bring in this notion of the middle term, something that mediates, something that connects things together, almost like a syllogism, a term that he uses over and over again in this phenomenology, also in his logic. Again, if you want to see how he treats the syllogism, the logic, the science of logic is the place to go. Here we need to think of this in terms of mediation, in terms of bringing the things together and somehow integrating them, filling in the gaps, you might say. And what are the gaps? Well, between the inner of the individual, the individuality, and the outer, what is being expressed by them. And we can talk about this outer in terms of the determinate shape, the gestalt of the person, maybe looking at their hand, maybe looking at their face, maybe looking at their form altogether. But even more so, what has been externalized through their action, through their speech, and through other things that we're going to find to be significant as well. In this paragraph, for example, we're going to have a hybrid of the hand and the mouth in handwriting. And so we'll get to that in a moment, but I just want to sort of put that on the radar right away. So he says, from the nature of the organ of activity, to be a passive being as well as the action within it. So there's already sort of a complex structure to the organ of activity, whether it's the hand, the mouth, or something else, in that it's involving passivity and activity. It's passive vis-a-vis the inner, for which it is indeed the organ, the tool, right? It's active in respect to the external world, which is a world for others. And we're going to see how being for others plays into this as well. So he says, from the fact that the in itselfness is itself present in it. Now, what is Miller translating by in itselfness or being for selfness, as I've got here? We could say being in and for itself. Well, what we've got there is an sich sein selbst. And the selbst is an intensifier of it, which means that it's not just an sich sein, that is, being in itself, being like a piece of chalk, being something that merely has existence or being, something that is, we might say, rein seiendes, it just is, right? It just has bare being. Rather, the inner and the tool, the hand, right, the mouth, has a being for itself that is a being in itself. This is an intensifier. There's a kind of, reflexive relation here that, or, at least that's what I'm reading into Hegel's use of the selbst there in relation to all the other things that he's saying. So, we're not so interested in that. I'm more interested in this being for others that comes up. He says that the organ has a being for others, right? He says we obtain another view of it than the preceding, than what we've looked at before. Why is he talking about being for others here? Well, you remember a few paragraphs before, we saw that there's this problem with externalizing oneself into the world, in that whatever you say, whatever you do, can be taken up by somebody else and interpreted in a different way. So the being for others introduces an element of, let's call it uncertainty or risk. Later on, however, he's going to talk about Bildung, what Miller's translated as cultivation and education. This is a very important term for Hegel. And what is Bildung? Well, we talked about this already way back in the preface, right? The entire course of this phenomenology of spirit is a history of, among other things, Bildung, of the human consciousness, the cultivation, the development. And it's something that goes from generation to generation. It doesn't mean that it stays exactly the same, but it means that there's a kind of continuity, a kind of dependability, a kind of being able to build off of what other people have left behind for you. So there's these two sides to being for other. There's the side of Bildung, which is something that, as he's going to say, affects the inner of the person, right? And there's the side of, well, whatever I do could kind of get lost in the shuffle of so many other beings. And this is a contrast that Hegel's not drawing here, but I want to bring up because it's one that runs throughout Hegel's work. The sort of, breaking up, being torn asunder, zerstören, right? And the long, steady cultivation that goes from generation to generation. These are both sides of the fact that we exist as human beings in a world of others. So, all that by way of preface, let's go on. He says, if the organs in general show themselves as being to be incapable of being taken as expressions of the inner, because in them the action qua action is present, but the action qua completed deed becomes merely external, and inner and outer in this way fall apart and can be alien to each other, then the organ must now take a more active role. The organ must now, in accordance with its nature, and that's a very interesting thing to say, in accordance with its nature. What in the nature of the hand or the mouth means that it has to be a middle term for the externality, the outerness of the world, a world of others, and the inner of who I am in myself, in my, as Hegel's going to say, my innate peculiarity, right? Well, that's something worth thinking about. I'm not going to try to answer that right now, but keep that in mind. The sentence goes on, and he says, here we go. The organ must now, in accordance with its nature, be taken also as a middle term of both, a mediating term between inner and outer. He says the very fact that action is present in it constitutes an externality of it. A simple externality is he's going to call it. Why is simple externality? Well, because it can take many forms. Simple, by the way, here is not the same thing as single, as we're going to see, right? So he says, here we go, the organ remains with and in the individual. Now this middle term and unity of inner and outer is in the first place itself external too. So it seems like we can draw a line here, right? But no, it's part of the person. He says, then this externality is at the same time taken up into the inner. Why? What the hell is it doing there in the first place? It's somebody's hand. It's somebody's mouth. And so it's not purely external. It's external, we might say, in a metaphorical way, insofar as maybe their soul is internal and the body of the hand is external. It's how they interface with the rest of the universe. But it's inner. It's part of the individuality. So he goes on and he says, as simple externality, it stands over against the dispersed externality, the scattered externality. What is the scattered externality? Well, Hegel tells us here in terms of the hand, not in terms of language or in terms of other things that are expressive in this way, that what we have on the one hand is the simple deed. That's how Miller is translating Werk, the thing that is done, or we might even say the thing that is made, right? Or the condition, the Zustand. So we can have the hand generating something single. Or it can be generating a totality. It can be understood as generating a whole bunch of deeds and conditions. And in both cases, like he says, we have, in the second case, we have fate split up into a multiplicity of deeds and conditions. And he says, thus the simple lines of the hand, the timbre and compass of the voice as the individual characteristic of speech. This too is expressed in writing. We're going to come back to that in a moment. All this is an expression of the inner, so that as a simple externality, as how it interfaces, the expression stands over again against the manifold externality of action and fate, stands in relation to them as an inner. So the organ is functioning as inner and outer. And we might say, the inner here is actually an outer in respect to the inner, and this outer here is an inner with respect to the fully outer. So what do we have going on here? Let's come back to this issue of writing now, this question. So he says, writing is where the hand gives speech more durable existence than the voice does. Isn't that an interesting thing to say? Now, we don't have to get into a whole, long disquisition on media or anything like that, but let's think, just for a moment about what's going on here. You're hearing my voice. By the time that you hear my voice, I'm no longer saying these things. We already talked about this way, way back in the, first section of the Phenomenology when we were talking about sense certainty, didn't we? And we talked about the, fact that when you talk, the voice is already dying out as you're saying it, even more so with this recorded stuff. When I write, or actually in my case, much more often, when I'm typing, what's going on? Is that expressive of me? Is that my hand? Or is that my voice? Or is it a weird amalgam of both? Is it a third thing? What about when we record it and we put it out there on the internet? And it's being placed into some sort of ether, what we call the cloud, because we have to have a metaphor for it. It's these massive server farms, which ultimately are supposed to, as we tell us, boil down to zeros and ones and circuits. How is that containing the individuality that's speaking to another individuality, that's you, on the other end? What about when you write your comment? Is that expressive of your individuality? Are you using an organ? You're using the organ of organs, right? The hand, but it's expressing what you would like to say. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. We're going to come back to this issue of writing several times. He says, if at first the specific nature and innate peculiarity of the individual, that's the inner, right, together with what these have become as a result of cultivation and education are taken as the inner, as the essence of his action and fate, then this essence has its appearance and externality, to begin with, in the organ, in his mouth, in his hand, voice. Notice that Hegel's saying voice here as something different than mouth. Otherwise, why say it? What is it that a voice can do? Well, he talked about the tone and the timbre of the voice earlier. That should be important for us. Then he talks about handwriting, right? And the other organs and their permanent characteristics. He doesn't name what those are. And he says, thereafter, and not till then, does it give itself further outward expression in its actual existence in the world. It's not as if we can sort of automatically just interface with the world without there being a mediating, as he's calling it here, organ. So why is this important? Well, because physiognomy is going to be spending its time looking at that organ, and Hegel wants us to look at it in a different way.